is no way.
It shows for one, the government can't sell it.
Today, the Queen and how the Republicans lost the plot. Alexander Downer explains. The Prime Minister is attacked for not curtsying, but who forgot to bow? Best price on cracking down on truants and being called a pet Aborigine, and why being a dictator is a health hazard. I'm Andrew Bolt, and this is the Bolt Report. When the Republicans lost the referendum 12 years ago to dump the Queen as our head of state, they were furious. Australian Republican movement head Malcolm Turnbull accused Prime Minister John Howard of dirty tricks.
He was the Prime Minister who broke this nation's heart.
Well, if our hearts were broken then, they're sure mended now. The Queen's 16th visit to Australia is a big success. Lots of people happy to welcome her, and the latest Morgan poll showing we're more against the Republic now than we've been in 20 years. Actually, I suspect most Australians couldn't care less. Monarchy, Republic, as long as it works, what's the problem? And with Prince William and his now new wife in the queue, well, game's up. Forget the debate about becoming a republic, it's over. Much more interesting is how this is now a class issue. 3 years ago, Kevin Rudd held his Ideas Summit of 1,000 of our best and brightest who were mad for a republic.
What I found impressive about the sentiment at the Australia 2020 summit was people's desire overwhelmingly, I thought, for us to move to a republic and to become a republic.
In fact, in one vote, 99 of those best and brightest backed the Republic to just 1 against, 99 to 1. Yet you saw the poll, more than half the rest of us don't want a republic or aren't sure. Now that's some divide. If you're of the cultural elite, you're almost certain to be a Republican. If you're on the outer, you probably aren't. But, funny thing, if you are of that Republican elite, you're also more likely to crack an invite to meet the Queen. Check out her arrival in Canberra. She gets welcomed by a Governor-General who's a Republican and a Prime Minister who's one too.
I obviously am a Republican. I believe that this nation should be a republic.
But here's what took the cake. Last week, the Queen warmed up for her tour with a reception for expat Australians at Buckingham Palace that was swarmed by celebrity Republicans like author Kathy Lette and her barrister husband Geoffrey Robertson, only too eager to mingle with royalty.
We were so raucous they couldn't get us to go home. You know, Aussies will never give up a party.
But having drunk the Queen's champagne, Lette had to prove her Republican cred by then abusing her gracious hostess.
They are a dysfunctional family. They make the Osbornes look functional. I mean, what with the toe-sucking, the bulimia, the affairs, the Nazi uniforms, Prince Andrew's paedophile pals, and Sophie and Fergie.
No class, no heart either, or none that seems broken by having the Queen still head of our country. Because it doesn't matter even to most Republicans. Saying you want a republic is just a social marker. You look progressive, but still get invites to royal events. And, of course, you still get a country, a constitutional monarchy that works. Win, win, win. Alexander Downer was Foreign Minister for nearly 12 years and has long been a supporter of Australians for constitutional monarchy. Thanks for joining us just off the plane from Dubai.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Malcolm Turnbull said our hearts were broken when the Republican proposal was knocked off 1999. We seem to have mended fairly quickly.
Well, I think he ought to remember that 55% of people voted for the status quo, so by definition their hearts weren't broken. So he wasn't speaking for everyone, and mine included. Was full of joy that night. I remember it well in November 1999.
So how have they stuffed it up? How have the Republican movement stuffed it up since? Because the support for the Republic has never been worse since.
I don't think it's so much them, by the way. I think at the end of the day, this is a country that quite rightly puts an enormous premium on stability. And this whole idea of making a major constitutional change is one that, well, it sounds all right when you make the argument, well, the Queen is British and we're Australian, so we should have one of our own as the head of state. But the more you reflect on it and the more you get into the detail, the more people think, yeah, but what are the unintended consequences of this going to be? And hang on, this works fine, the system we've got at the moment, that's not the biggest problem Australia faces. So I think at the end of the day, it doesn't come down to whether you're a monarchist or a Republican or whether you think the Queen is British or not. It comes down to whether you think the Constitution is consistent and stable, or you want to have a constitutional upheaval. And every night on TV, people are seeing scenes of places which are going through constitutional upheaval, and they're thinking, not for me, mate. And they're quite right.
Well, it's interesting you say that because one of those places, of course, is Libya, where you've seen a president, a dictator, now shot dead. There's lots of scenes of celebration now about, oh, Libya and the NATO thing worked, you know, NATO coming in, helping the rebels. Are we celebrating or are we thinking, oh, my goodness, what's going to come next?
Well, there are two things to say about that. First of all, he was a terrible, evil dictator, responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of people, so no wonder they're happy to see him go. 42 years ago, there was celebration in the streets of Tripoli as well. That was when Gaddafi overthrew, by the way, the monarchy. King Idris was overthrown by Colonel Gaddafi. I have a view that revolutions usually go in a full circle. In Iran, when the Shah was overthrown, celebrations in the streets of Tehran replaced with a theocratic dictatorship, which is a lot worse. What will replace Gaddafi? The opponents of Gaddafi are only united in one thing, their opposition to Colonel Gaddafi. That's all they're...
So now the infighting begins.
And now the infighting begins. They're in different tribes, they're different from different regions, some are Islamists, some are anti-Islamists.
Some of the key positions are being held by Islamists. Some, and some by more secular Muslims, if it's not a contradiction in terms, more moderate Muslims. They vary a lot. But if you think this is going to usher in a glorious era of democracy, then when did a revolution do that? The French Revolution didn't, the Russian and Chinese revolutions didn't, and as I just mentioned, nor in 1979 did the Iranian Revolution. So do you think there is possibly a time may come when the West will say, we were wrong to get rid of Gaddafi?
Well, I don't think they'll say that. I mean, I'm not sure that getting rid of Gaddafi is a bad thing. But the West will have to think very carefully about what is going to happen next. Now, this is an incredibly violent society. As you know, Colonel Gaddafi was clearly executed, and as was his son. There's no question of that. I was, you know, not so much sympathetic about that, but I was struck by what happened to his two bodyguards who were with him when he was found in the drain underneath the road. Both of them were shot, and one of them was decapitated by the crowd.
And we've actually missed that. There have been a number of decapitations and of opponents in the past, and the West has not wanted to look at that.
No, it's not part of the narrative. But it's just worth, you know, don't always be swept up, and I'm sure you're not, by the you know, fashionable narrative, the Arab Spring, glorious era of democracy arriving. Have a look at what people are saying and what people are doing. This is a very violent culture. As you know, Iraq has a very violent culture too. And you saw what happened after Saddam Hussein was overthrown. Libya is very violent. And I think it's going to be very hard going from now on. Sure, get rid of Gaddafi, I don't have any problems with that. But when I sat down with the foreign minister of a very significant European country recently and asked him about the Libyan opposition, the transitional government, and what sort of people they were, he said, I guess we're just going to have to find that out. Now, that's not very encouraging when they're sending warplanes in and helping the transitional government dislodge Gaddafi and his people. But they don't really know who they're supporting.
Yes, I think there may be a case, this may be a case of having blundered in without having an exit plan, as was so often levied against you in Iraq. But Alexander Downer, thank you so much for taking the time to drop in.
It's a pleasure.
And coming up, has the Queen done Tony Abbott a favour? Our panel after this. The Queen's visit drowned out the political debate this week, which may have suited the opposition. Public servants this week told Senate estimates hearings of problems with two of the opposition's boat people policies. The Secretary of the Immigration Department said the Nauru solution wouldn't work this time.
Combination of circumstances that existed at the end of 2001 could not be repeated with success.
And the Navy chief said turning back the boats was dangerous.
There have been fires lit, there have been attempts to storm the engine compartment.
Joining me this week is former New South Wales Labor Treasurer Michael Costa and former federal Liberal MP Ross Cameron. Ross, was this a case of the opposition under pressure from public servants disagreeing with their policies, or is that just public servants saying what their masters want?
Well, I don't think it's rocket science that turning back the boats is dangerous, but doing nothing is dangerous. I mean, the fact that you now have this flotilla of boats since this Labor policy was enacted is dangerous. I think the best estimates say that between 500 and 1,000 people have been lost at sea.
Where are the left on this?
Because, and this is the, I mean, we know how many boats arrive, we don't know how many boats leave Indonesia, and this is the great sadness. I mean, we've seen people killed in the Pink 100 house fires and people killed in pink bats. Obviously, we've lost Australian troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, but no policy has been so costly in human lives as Labor's asylum seeker policies.
So, Michael, is this a case of a dispute over how effective the opposition's policies would be? Luckily for the opposition was drowned out by the Queen's arrival, or is this an argument that Labor could...
Look, I think it's over. I mean, the game changer on this was the cabinet leaks. You know, there was a point where I thought Tony Abbott could have been in trouble on the issue, but those cabinet leaks, the way
These
they
are
were...
the leaks where it said that...
Where they supported Nauru.
Where a number of people in the immigration
it's
ministry
over.
supported
This debate is over.
Right.
Labor has lost, and now it's a case of people trying to save face. I mean, strategic leaks from the New South Wales right, and I think they are from the right, to protect Chris Bowen, but also to distance themselves from the Prime Minister. Tony Abbott's won this issue.
Oh, so it wasn't... You don't think it was Kevin Rudd doing Kevin Rudd's usual leaking? You think it was Chris Bowen protecting himself?
I think it was allies of Chris Bowen and the New South Wales right trying to protect themselves in the face of potential leadership changes either towards the end of this year or early next year.
Ross, much of the media agreed that the opposition was under pressure over the last week over another issue as well, and that was Tony Abbott's warning to business not to buy future permits for emissions, carbon emissions, to hedge against losses after 2015 when carbon trading then comes in. With the Energy Supply Association said this created uncertainty, prices would rise, etc., etc. Is this a damaging accusation against Tony Abbott?
Oh, look, I think Tony's, you know, is an imperfect human being, but I don't find any substance in this particular criticism. I think if Abbott comes out and says, I'm opposed to the policy, and if I'm elected, I'll repeal it, there could be nothing more certain and simple than his policy on this issue.
Michael, I don't buy this argument either. I mean, I would have thought that if a businessman says, well, look, I'll bank on Tony Abbott winning, repealing, you don't need to buy future permits.
Tony Abbott's done the right thing. He's stated very clearly what his policy is, and if you're a strategic planner in any business out there that's involved in this area, you have to factor that in. In fact, he's done the right thing by making his policy very clear, and it's absolutely a nonsense because we've got a carbon price to come in first before we move to an emission trading scheme where the property rights start to become embedded.
Right, so when we see the media speculation about Tony Abbott having come under pressure this week on his various policies, you need to explain yourself better, Tony Abbott. I look at the two policies that they're arguing about, boats and the carbon dioxide tax. Tony Abbott would be happy to argue that from now to the election, whenever it happens.
If that's the agenda, Tony's in front. And I think what we are seeing, and this is Australia's problem, that you've got a government almost like an aircraft that if it gets slow enough, it stalls. And that's what we've seen, a government that's stalled, and it's now become entirely preoccupied with its own problems. If you don't know who's going to... And so there's no possible way that senior cabinet ministers can be focused on the real needs of their portfolio, especially making any kind of difficult decision when they know from week to week they've got no idea whether any decision in cabinet is going to stay confidential because everyone is jockeying for their position in the next phase of this government. So please, either let's have an election or let's remove Julia and put somebody else in there.
Michael, it seems to me then that Labor desperately needs a different agenda. I mean, it's stuck with these two Groundhog Day things. And so I was struck by Paul Keating this week. He's got a new book coming out called After Labor, and he got some coverage about one of his messages being that the Rudd and Gillard governments didn't have an overarching and compelling story. Big news. And that Labor has failed to represent the new economic class it helped to create. And I quote, Labor must be open to the influences of this middle class, to people on higher incomes, and I don't think it is. I would have thought that Labor is actually listening too much to the new class, but
no,
what do you think?
Once again, Paul Keating hits the political nail right on the head. Labor has no story to tell those aspiring Australians, those people that want to get on with economic growth, build their wealth for their families, what Labor's vision is. We're bogged down in a quagmire of policies that are really of no interest to the average middle-class Australian. They are a function of the alliance with the Greens, and that alliance with the Greens is dictating the policy agenda for the Gillard government. What they've got to do is get back to the Hawke-Keating model, which is economic reform, wealth creation, and a distribution of wealth in a sensible, targeted way, rather than this ham-fisted way that we're seeing it at the moment.
So you're making a distinction between, when I hear people talking about this new Labor class, I'm thinking about green-leaning, environmentalism, multiculturalism, all that kind of stuff.
These are the people that want the McMansions. They want to have high standards of living. They like to have the 2 cars. They like their kids to go to good schools.
Mark Latham's constituency.
Well, Mark's spoken about them, but this was the Hawke-Keating core constituency. It was what the New South Wales right was based around, and it is the only place for Labor to be, supporting those people, moving away from the Greens. As long as we're mired in this quagmire of Green policies, we are in trouble.
Ross, John McTernan has just been appointed head of Julia Gillard's new media unit. Very savvy guy from Britain. What message would you think he should be telling Julia Gillard along these messages about what overarching message you should be pumping out?
Well, the only thing that will save Labor is a sustained period of good government. I mean, what we need to see, I mean, you build momentum on the basis of achievements, on the basis of taking difficult decisions, good decisions, sticking to them, implementing them effectively and doing it again. And so even though, for example, you know, John Howard, he had his issues and he had his problems and he was never sort of Mr. Charismatic, but he picked his top 3 things. He said, this is what we're going to do, and he just went one after the other, bang, 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 and people knew where they were going. And that's what I'd be saying to this government. You've got to work out what is your agenda and then go ahead and execute it effectively.
But is Julia Gillard capable of that?
Well, look, I have the feeling that she is now, you know, she's like the injured, sort of bleeding creature in the water now. And it's purely a question of who, you know, who gives the tap on the shoulder and when it happens, who the replacement is.
Now, you say, Michael, that you can't do that with the Greens there, but I think you can in the sense that where are the Greens going to go? I think Labor should simply stare them down.
I agree with that. I mean, the Greens would support Labor, I would have thought, on the floor of the Parliament. It's the formalised alliance. She needs to walk away from that, drop the issues that underpin that, and, you know, test if she has to in the Parliament. But whilst we're caught in that green straitjacket, her ability to govern for the majority of Australians, for middle Australia particularly, is diminished.
Now, we've got to go soon, but I just wanted to say, Tony Abbott, it's a bit hard for Tony Abbott to have small conversation. He's a big conversation guy, and I think that was illustrated when he met the Queen this week, and it was straight into real tough policy. Julia Gillard talked about the flower show when she met the Queen, but have a listen. This is Tony Abbott. He gets straight into the politics.
It's an interesting time to have it.
It's never dull. We play our politics tough in this country. We give no quarter.
Well, what would you have said in his position, Ross?
Oh, well, I think that's, you know, a pretty frank Here's Tony saying, let's talk about the reality of our situation, which is, you know, not a bad place to start.
We might have preferred that to talking about flower shows and all that.
He might have too. And certainly, I mean, he is talking to an historical figure. I mean, we know most Australians sort of notionally would prefer a republic of some description, but there is no doubt this Queen will go down in history.
Yep, I think she would have enjoyed that one. Michael Costa, Ross Cameron, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up, best price on making parents pay for truant children. There were worries when Labor won government that it would wind back the intervention in the Northern Territory's Aboriginal communities, which made sure parents spent some of their welfare payments on their children. Well, Indigenous Affairs Minister Jenny Macklin this week said the intervention would be extended. Parents who don't send their kids to school would have their welfare docked. Northern Territory's Indigenous Advisory Council Chairwoman Bess Price joins me. Bess, this is great news, right?
It is great news, what Jenny Macklin's trying to do, and it'd be great to see it, you know, being taken a bit further, extended, so you know, it can help our people here on the ground.
Extended in what way, Bess?
Extended in that the funding doesn't stop. That's what we're worried about. As long as we have funding to help our people with the education, with the health, with the housing, that would be great.
Now, we've seen some Indigenous leaders actually complain about this, saying that the problem is that you'd be cutting welfare to the parents, you're hurting the kids.
This has been talked of for years, so many years. My sister was a teacher. She's passed on now. She was a teacher. She started teaching in the 80s. And even then, people were saying then that we need to penalise the parents because they're not helping to send their kids to school.
My dad was a teacher in the Northern Territory, Bess, and I get the impression that education standards, particularly for Aboriginal kids over the last generation, have dropped.
That's right. And what I've always said is that, look, treat our children the same as you treat anybody else in Australia, and give them quality education that's needed, and to teach them properly.
And I just wonder, Bess, whether this is something that shouldn't be extended to people on welfare throughout the country, that if you're not sending your kids to school, you get your welfare docked, whether you're Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal.
That's right. It should be across the board. When the intervention was rolled out, people complained that it was just targeted on Aboriginal people. So Jenny Macklin went out and consulted with people and then decided that it should be other recipients as well of welfare payments. And she's been able to do that here in the Territory, and why not do it with parenting payments?
Well, I think you're right. Now, listen, when you put up your head as an Aboriginal leader to advocate things like this, boy, do you sometimes get it kicked. And I noticed that people like the education activist Chris Sarah was saying, for example, that you're just a pet Aborigine, excusing the intervention like this. How do you respond to that kind of, well, I think it's a racist slur?
Well, Chris Sarah, I really supported what he was about. And I was so grateful that we did have people like Chris Sarra out there who is fighting for the rights of our people. But to say that about people like myself is not downright. Well, it's worse than what you'd been through, I guess, for myself, because coming from a fellow Aboriginal person and academic, it's made me feel as if we don't have brains in our head to decide for ourselves what's best for our people here on the ground.
Yeah, no, look, you're quite right, Bess. I thought it was right out of order. Thank you so much for joining us, and good luck with your work.
Thank you.
What a ridiculous fuss about Julia Gillard not curtsying to the Queen this week and choosing to bow instead. In fact, royal protocol says it's up to you whether to curtsy or bow, and a curtsy from the Prime Minister would seem not the real Julia. In fact, check who bowed best to the Queen on Friday. Look at that, a great bow. But from opposition leader Tony Abbott, barely even a nod. Yet who gets yelled at for not showing the proper respect? Cut Gillard some slack. And that's the show. Thanks for watching. Please join our debate by sending me an email here at 10, and there's also my blog. Meet the Press is next with Paul Bongiorno. I'm Andrew Bolt. Goodbye.